Little girl sobbed, "I'm so hungry, please give me bread." Her desperate plea echoed through the kitchen, a heartbreaking sound that would change more lives than anyone could imagine. The cruel stepmother's refusal was just the beginning of a story that would eventually cross paths with an unexpected millionaire. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning air in Willow Creek, Indiana, was cold enough to bite bare feet, but Sarah Johnson barely noticed as she pressed her face against the bakery window. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread somehow managed to seep through the glass, making her empty stomach twist painfully. Her small hands trembled, knuckles whitening against the window, eyes fixed on the golden loaves arranged in perfect rows, food she could only dream of tasting. "Just one piece," she whispered, her breath creating a small cloud on the glass. Sarah hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, when Margaret had allowed her a single slice of stale bread before school. Inside the warm bakery, Edith Brown noticed the child's longing gaze. The baker's wife hesitated, a torn look crossing her face as she wiped flour-covered hands on her apron. She had seen Sarah here before, always looking but never entering. Something about the girl's hollow cheeks and too large clothes made Edith's heart ache. She took a step toward the door, a fresh roll in hand. "Sarah!" A sharp voice sliced through the moment like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret Johnson strode down the sidewalk, her expensive coat buttoned tightly against the morning chill, eyes narrowed with disdain. Several townspeople on their morning errands suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. "I was just looking," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Begging is what you were doing," her stepmother hissed, grabbing Sarah's thin wrist. "Embarrassing me in front of the entire town." Inside the bakery, Edith froze, the warm roll still in her hand. She watched as Margaret yanked the child away from the window, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into Sarah's arm. "Please," Sarah whispered. "I'm so hungry." Margaret's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You'll eat when you deserve it, not before." The small crowd of morning shoppers averted their eyes as the stepmother dragged the child down Main Street. No one intervened. No one spoke. The silence in Willow Creek was absolute, broken only by the sound of Sarah's shoes scraping against the pavement as she struggled to keep pace with Margaret's angry strides. From her shop window, Edith Brown watched them disappear around the corner toward the old Johnson estate at the edge of town. The roll in her hand had grown cold. She placed it back on the tray, her movements mechanical, guilt settling heavily on her shoulders. Sarah's hunger echoed in every step as Margaret marched her home, the child's eyes downcast, her spirit diminishing with each passing moment. The floorboards creaked as Sarah Johnson tiptoed across her cramped attic room, careful not to disturb the silence that hung heavily throughout the house. Moonlight spilled through the small window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The young girl reached beneath her thin mattress, fingers searching until they found the familiar texture of her most prized possession, a battered notebook with fraying edges and a faded blue cover. Sarah settled onto her bed, wincing as her stomach growled loudly in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, a meager portion of cold oatmeal that Margaret had grudgingly provided. Pressing her palm against her belly, she tried to quiet the rumbling, terrified that her stepmother might hear and punish her for what Margaret called attention-seeking behavior. The notebook opened to reveal pages filled with colorful sketches and carefully printed words. This was Sarah's escape, her private world where she could be anything but hungry and afraid. Tonight, she added to a story about a girl who lived in a house made of bread, where kind neighbors brought fresh milk every morning, and no one ever went to bed with an empty stomach. "One day," she whispered to herself as her pencil moved across the page, "someone will hear me." Her stomach protested again, and Sarah bit her lip hard. She remembered Mrs. Brown's sympathetic gaze through the bakery window that morning. The baker's wife had almost almost offered her a roll before Margaret yanked her away. The memory of fresh bread, so close yet unreachable, made her hunger sharper. "You're worthless," Margaret had hissed on their walk home. "No one wants to hear your whining. No one cares." Each cutting word had lodged itself in Sarah's heart like tiny splinters. She'd learned to hide her tears, knowing they only fueled her stepmother's cruelty. Instead, she poured her pain into her stories, creating worlds where little girls were cherished, not silenced. In one tale, a princess escaped a wicked queen by befriending magical birds. In another, a child discovered she could grow flowers with her tears. Sarah's imagination was her fortress against Margaret's coldness. Each story a brick in the wall protecting what remained of her self-worth. The floor beneath her suddenly creaked. Someone was coming up the stairs. Sarah quickly tucked the notebook under her pillow and pretended to be asleep. Her heart pounded as footsteps paused outside her door. After an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The small girl exhaled shakily, her hand finding the notebook again. Even as her confidence wavered and her hope dimmed, Sarah clung to her stories. In them, she wasn't just the hungry girl with sad eyes. She was brave, she was loved, and most importantly, she mattered. 3 days later, Willow Creek stirred with unusual excitement. The townsfolk gathered along Main Street, their morning routines interrupted by the purr of an engine that didn't belong to any local vehicle. A sleek black car rolled slowly down the dusty road, its polished surface reflecting the curious faces of onlookers who seldom witnessed such luxury in their small Indiana town. The automobile came to a stop outside Edith Brown's bakery, its tires crunching on loose gravel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door swung open, and a tall figure emerged. Michael Davis stood with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. His tailored suit and polished shoes marked him immediately as an outsider, but there was something in his eyes, a searching intensity, that made the townsfolk step back instinctively. "That's Michael Davis," whispered an elderly man to his wife. "The millionaire from Chicago. What's he doing in Willow Creek?" The philanthropist straightened his jacket and surveyed the street. His reputation had preceded him, a reclusive figure whose wealth was matched only by the mystery surrounding his personal life. Stories circulated about his charitable foundations, his business acumen, and his tendency to appear in small towns without warning, only to vanish just as suddenly. Michael walked with deliberate steps toward the bakery, nodding politely at those brave enough to meet his gaze. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and conversations hushed. Mrs. Brown looked up from behind the counter, flour dusting her apron, surprise evident on her face. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentle, yet carrying an undercurrent of authority. "I'm looking for someone." Edith wiped her hands nervously on her apron. "Who might that be, sir?" Michael's expression softened slightly. "Where can I find the girl with the sad eyes?" he asked. "The one who watches your bread through the window." The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, those who had followed him pressed closer to the windows, straining to hear. Mrs. Brown's hands trembled slightly as she set down her rolling pin. "Sarah Johnson," she said quietly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "But her stepmother keeps her close." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Some exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly conscious of their collective silence regarding the Johnson household. For years, they had witnessed Sarah's hollow cheeks and downcast eyes, Margaret's sharp words and tighter grip, yet no one had intervened. "The Johnson place is up on Maple Street," offered a man near the door, his voice tinged with something between guilt and relief. "But I wouldn't go there uninvited. Margaret Johnson doesn't take kindly to strangers asking about family matters." Michael nodded, his determination evident. "Thank you," he said simply, leaving the townsfolk to wonder what connection this wealthy stranger could possibly have to their most vulnerable resident. Margaret Johnson tightened her grip on Sarah's thin wrist as they hurried down Main Street of Willow Creek. The arrival of Michael Davis had sent ripples of curiosity through their small Indiana town, and Margaret was determined to keep her stepdaughter far from prying eyes, especially those of wealthy strangers asking questions. "Walk faster," she hissed, pulling Sarah along the sidewalk. Several townsfolk glanced their way, but quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to challenge Margaret's authority. Back at the Johnson estate, Margaret locked the front door and turned to Sarah with ice in her eyes. "I saw you staring at that man's car today. Listen carefully. You are nothing without me. Remember that." Her words sliced through the air like knives. "Your mother left you with nothing but trouble, and I'm the only one who took you in. You'd be in some orphanage if not for my generosity." Sarah stood perfectly still, her small face a mask of practiced calm. Though her heart hammered in her chest, she refused to give her stepmother the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Years of similar treatment had taught her to hide her pain behind careful silence. She simply nodded, eyes downcast. "Go to your room. No dinner tonight. Maybe hunger will teach you gratitude," Margaret said, turning away with a dismissive wave. The narrow staircase to the attic creaked under Sarah's weight as she climbed to her cramped bedroom. The space was sparse, a thin mattress, a rickety desk, and a small window that overlooked the property. Her stomach growled painfully, but she was used to going to bed hungry. Later that night, when the house fell silent and darkness wrapped around her like a familiar blanket, Sarah pulled out her battered notebook. As she leaned against the wall to write, her elbow dislodged a loose board near her bed. Curious, she pried it further, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Her fingers trembled as they closed around something flat and papery. A photograph, faded and slightly bent at the corners, emerged from the hiding place. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was her mother, young and beautiful, smiling beside a man she'd never seen before. His arm was around her mother's waist, his expression tender. In his free hand gleamed a pocket watch, its chain catching the light. Sarah traced her mother's face with a gentle finger. Who was this man? Why had her mother hidden this photo? The image burned in her mind, igniting questions she'd never dared to ask. For the first time in years, something stirred within her, not just hunger or loneliness, but curiosity, and with it came something even more dangerous: hope. Edith Brown stood at the bakery window, flour-dusted hands pressed against the glass as she watched Sarah Johnson trudge down Main Street. The girl's shoulders hunched forward, making her small frame appear even tinier against Willow Creek's sprawling landscape. A familiar ache spread through Edith's chest, the weight of words unspoken, of help ungiven. "I should have done something," she whispered to herself, remembering the hunger in Sarah's eyes days earlier. The baker's wife had spent years building her reputation in this tight-knit Indiana community. Yet here she was, paralyzed by the subtle threat of Margaret Johnson's influence. The stepmother had connections with every prominent family in town, including the mayor's office and the school board. Edith turned away, busying herself with the day's last batch of sourdough. 20 years ago, she had sworn never to be silenced again after watching her own mother suffer under another woman's cruelty. Yet here she was, breaking that promise daily. She kneaded the dough with unnecessary force, her frustration finding outlet in the simple task. Across town at Willow Creek Elementary, Emily Smith spotted Sarah sitting alone during lunch period. The spirited 10-year-old glanced around to ensure no teachers were watching before sliding onto the bench beside her friend. Emily's bright yellow backpack contrasted sharply with Sarah's faded hand-me-down clothes. "You didn't bring lunch again," Emily observed, her voice low but fierce with loyalty. She casually pushed half her sandwich across the table. "My mom always packs too much anyway." Sarah hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly before accepting the offering. "Margaret says I don't deserve." "Stop," Emily interrupted, grabbing Sarah's hand. Her eyes, normally dancing with mischief, turned serious. "I believe you deserve better. Way better." The words hung between them, simple yet revolutionary. Sarah's lips curved into a tentative smile, the first genuine one in days. Their friendship blossomed in these stolen moments, whispered conversations behind the gymnasium, notes passed during math class, and secret meetings at the old willow tree after school. Each shared laugh became an act of rebellion against the darkness that permeated Sarah's home life. For Emily, the friendship was natural. She'd always been drawn to protecting others. For Sarah, it was salvation. In Emily's unwavering belief, she found something Margaret couldn't take away: the knowledge that someone in this world saw her value. As Edith watched from her window day after day, something shifted in her heart. The girl with sad eyes had found a friend, and perhaps it was time the baker's wife found her courage. Michael Davis's arrival in Willow Creek set tongues wagging. His sleek black car, parked outside the county records office, became a fixture as the millionaire methodically pieced together the history of the Johnson estate. The reclusive philanthropist asked pointed questions about Sarah's mother and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death 5 years ago. "There was a time when that property was the jewel of our town," Mrs. Peterson from the Historical Society told him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Everything changed after Elizabeth passed. The gardens withered, and that poor child." As Michael continued his investigation, the comfortable social circles Margaret Johnson had cultivated began to fracture. At the monthly ladies' auxiliary meeting, her usual supporters exchanged uneasy glances when she entered the room. The wealthy widow had always maintained that her stepdaughter's biological father had abandoned them, leaving her to shoulder the burden alone. But Michael's questions revealed inconsistencies in her story. "I don't remember Elizabeth ever mentioning financial troubles," confided Judith Williams, who had been Elizabeth's closest friend. In fact, she often spoke of Sarah's future being secure. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself drawn to this mysterious stranger. Their first meeting happened by chance. She was sitting alone on the school steps, waiting for the late bus, when his automobile pulled up. "You must be Sarah," he said gently, keeping a respectful distance. "I knew your mother once." Those 5 words changed everything. Against Margaret's explicit instructions to avoid strangers, Sarah began meeting Michael secretly in the public park after school. The girl would slip away from her usual route home, heart pounding with both fear and hope. During these clandestine meetings, Michael never pushed her pride. Instead, he simply listened as Sarah shared fragments of memories: her mother's favorite song, the smell of her perfume, the way she would tuck Sarah in at night with stories of brave princesses who saved themselves. "Sometimes I feel like I'm forgetting her," Sarah admitted one afternoon, her small fingers tracing patterns on a park bench. "And other times, I feel like someone took away the life I was supposed to have." Michael nodded, his eyes kind but sad. "Trust those feelings, Sarah. Our hearts remember truths our minds sometimes forget." What neither of them noticed was Mrs. Brown watching from a distance, torn between loyalty to the community's unspoken rules and the growing certainty that the quiet child with sad eyes deserved better than what fate and Margaret had given her. Sarah's notebook transformed with each passing day. Where once she'd filled pages with fantastical creatures and imaginary friends, her pencil now traced memories that bubbled up from somewhere deep within. A Victorian house with a wraparound porch appeared on one page, though she couldn't recall ever living in such a place. On another, she carefully notated a lullaby, the melody her mother used to hum while brushing her hair before bed. "What are you always scribbling in that book?" Margaret Johnson demanded one evening, her shadow falling across Sarah's drawings. The little girl clutched her notebook to her chest. "Just pictures," she whispered. Margaret's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Let me see that." Sarah reluctantly handed over her treasured possession. As her stepmother flipped through the pages, her expression darkened. The young girl had sketched a wooden box buried beneath an old oak tree, the very box Margaret had thought no one knew about. "Where did you see this?" The woman's voice was dangerously quiet. "In my dreams," Sarah answered truthfully. "I keep seeing it." Margaret snapped the notebook shut. "Dreams are nonsense. Focus on your schoolwork instead of this foolishness." But Sarah couldn't stop the images from coming. Each night, more fragments of her past emerged. Her mother's face, clearer than she'd remembered it in years. The pocket watch that a kind man had once let her hold. The sound of laughter echoing through rooms much grander than their current home. When Willow Creek announced its annual Harvest Festival, Sarah's teacher, Mrs. Wilson, selected her poem about autumn leaves to be read on stage. For the first time in months, pride replaced the constant hunger in Sarah's belly. "I've been chosen to read my poem," she told Margaret that evening, hope flickering in her voice. Her stepmother's response was immediate and crushing. "Absolutely not. You will not embarrass me in front of the entire town." "But Mrs. Wilson said it was beautiful," Sarah protested softly. Margaret's hand came down hard on the table. "You will not participate. That's final." On the day of the festival, Sarah stood in the crowd, watching as Emily's cousin, Lily, climbed the wooden steps to the stage. The girl unfolded a familiar piece of paper and began reading words that Sarah had written, words that had poured from her heart. Emily found Sarah afterward, squeezing her hand in silent support. "Everyone loved your poem," she whispered. "They just don't know it's yours." Sarah nodded, swallowing her disappointment. But as she walked home, she realized something important. Her voice could reach others, even when Margaret tried to silence it. Rain drummed against the windows of the county records office as Michael Davis hunched over stacks of yellowed papers. His fingers, methodical and determined, traced through decades of property transfers, birth certificates, and wills. The millionaire had spent 3 days here, his expensive suit gathering dust as he pieced together the puzzle of Sarah Johnson's past. When he found it, the truth hit him like a physical blow. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic paperwork was an unaltered will and testament naming Sarah as the sole heir to the Johnson estate. A property worth millions, complete with investments her biological father had carefully arranged before his death. "My God," Michael whispered, his hands trembling as he compared the documents with Sarah's current records. Margaret had systematically erased the child's rightful identity, changing her last name from Caldwell to Johnson after her mother's death, and fabricating a story about Sarah being born from a previous marriage. The rain intensified as Michael drove back to his temporary lodgings at Willow Creek's only hotel. The windshield wipers couldn't keep pace with his racing thoughts. This wasn't just neglect, it was calculated theft of a child's birthright. Word spread quickly through town. The baker's wife shared hushed conversations with customers. The school principal noticed the sudden interest in Sarah's welfare. Even Mr. Thompson, who rarely involved himself in town gossip, found himself discussing the situation at church. Margaret sensed the shift. She kept Sarah home from school for 2 days, claiming illness. When they appeared together at the grocery store, her grip on the girl's shoulder was visibly tighter, her smile more forced than ever. "You will not speak to anyone without my permission," she hissed as they walked down Main Street, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Sarah's thin arm. "Do you understand me?" Someone, Michael suspected Mrs. Brown, finally contacted Child Services. The day the social worker arrived, Sarah was escorted from the Johnson house, clutching only her battered notebook and a small backpack. For 7 terrifying days, she stayed with a foster family on the edge of town. Emily tried desperately to visit her friend, but was turned away. Michael attempted to intervene legally, presenting his findings to the authorities, but the system moved with agonizing slowness. Then, inexplicably, Sarah was returned to Margaret's custody. The social worker who had been so concerned suddenly closed the case. The local judge, a longtime associate of Margaret's late husband, signed the necessary papers without a hearing. "She has connections everywhere," Michael told Mrs. Brown during a tense meeting at the bakery. "But she's made a mistake. She doesn't know what I found." The reclusive philanthropist watched through the rain-streaked window as Margaret marched Sarah down the street, the child's head bowed lower than ever. This battle had only just begun. The willow tree's branches swayed gently, creating a private sanctuary for Sarah Johnson and Emily Smith. The girls huddled close, their faces flushed with excitement and trepidation. Emily had brought a small garden shovel, borrowed from her father's shed, without permission. "My mother used to bring me here," Sarah whispered, running her fingers through the soft grass. "I remember her pointing to this spot, saying something about keeping memories safe." The girls dug carefully, taking turns with the shovel until it struck something solid. Their eyes widened as they unearthed the metal box, its surface corroded, but the lock still intact. Sarah's hands trembled as she produced a small key from her pocket, one she'd found hidden in the lining of her mother's old music box months ago. "I never knew what it was for," she admitted, voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. The lock clicked open, revealing a leather-bound journal. Sarah opened it with reverence, Emily leaning close. The pages contained her mother's elegant handwriting, stories of love, dreams for her daughter's future, and cryptic references to the Johnson estate's true ownership. She knew, Sarah breathed, tears welling in her eyes. She knew Margaret would try to take everything. Meanwhile, across town, Michael Davis sat in his temporary lodgings, a coughing fit racking his thin frame. The millionaire's condition had deteriorated rapidly in recent weeks, his skin taking on an alarming pallor. When Sarah visited him later that afternoon, she noticed immediately how his hands shook as he poured her tea. "There's something I need to tell you," Michael said, his voice weaker than before. He gestured for Sarah to sit beside him. "I knew your mother, Elizabeth. We were very close once." Sarah clutched the journal to her chest. "You loved her?" Michael nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "More than anything, but circumstances kept us apart. When I learned of her passing, I made a promise to find you, to make sure you were safe and receive what was rightfully yours." "The estate," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning. "Everything," he confirmed. "Your mother's family built this town, Sarah. The bakery, the land, it all belongs to you." Michael reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his failing health. "I don't have much time left, but I intend to keep my promise. No matter what Margaret does, no matter who stands in our way, I will make sure you get back what was stolen from you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but for once they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Sarah's heart sank when she discovered her notebook missing from its hiding place beneath her mattress. For 3 agonizing days, she searched every corner of her cramped attic room, panic rising with each passing hour. That notebook contained everything: her dreams, fears, and the secret meetings with Michael Davis that could upend Margaret's carefully constructed world. When the notebook finally reappeared on her desk, Sarah Johnson immediately knew something was wrong. Pages had been torn out, others marked with angry red slashes. Worst of all, the entries about Michael and the mysterious inheritance were circled repeatedly, the pressure of the pen nearly cutting through the paper. "She knows everything now," Sarah whispered to herself, fingers trembling as she traced the violated pages. Margaret had invaded her most private thoughts. Reading about her longing for escape, her suspicions about her mother's death, and her growing alliance with the millionaire. That evening at dinner, Margaret's eyes gleamed with cold calculation. "Quite the imagination you have," she remarked casually, watching Sarah over the rim of her water glass. "Stories about hidden fortunes and secret meetings. Perhaps you should focus more on schoolwork than fantasies." The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah stared at her plate, stomach knotting with fear, but something else stirred within her, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. The next day at school, Emily Smith rushed to Sarah's side, her face flushed with distress. "My parents forbid me from seeing you anymore," she whispered. "Mother says your family situation is complicated, and that I should focus on more appropriate friendships." Sarah's shoulders slumped. Margaret's influence had reached even the Smith household, isolating her further. "I understand," she murmured, though her heart ached at losing her only friend. But Emily wasn't finished. "I told them I would obey," she continued, a rebellious glint in her eye. "But what they don't know won't hurt them." She pressed a folded note into Sarah's palm. "Meet me behind the old oak tree after school. We'll figure something out." True to her word, Emily created an elaborate system. Notes appeared mysteriously in Sarah's locker, containing words of encouragement and updates about town gossip. They met in hidden corners of the schoolyard, behind the library stacks, and occasionally at the creek where no one would see them. "Margaret can't control everything," Emily insisted during one of their secret meetings. "And she definitely can't stop us from being friends." For the first time in weeks, Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The invasion of her privacy had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable, but it had also ignited something within her. If Margaret was worried enough to read her notebook, then perhaps Sarah's suspicions were right. Perhaps there was truth to be uncovered, and justice to be found. "It belonged to your grandfather, you know," Edith Brown whispered, her hands trembling as she wiped flour from the bakery counter. Sarah Johnson stared at her, wide-eyed, as the baker's wife glanced nervously toward the door. "This whole shop, your mother grew up kneading dough right where I'm standing." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She ran her small fingers along the worn wooden counter, suddenly seeing it differently, as a piece of her own history, not just the place where she pressed her hungry face against the window. "What happened to it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Brown's eyes darted around the empty shop. "After your mother passed, things changed quickly. The paperwork, the sale, it all happened so fast. No one quite understood." She leaned closer. "Your grandfather built this place with his own hands. Everyone said the bread here tasted like home." Sarah absorbed this new knowledge, another piece of the puzzle that was her past. The bakery that had tormented her with its unreachable warmth was actually part of her birthright, something else Margaret had taken from her. That evening, avoiding her stepmother's cold gaze, Sarah slipped out to the edge of the property where an old oak tree stood sentinel. Her mother had loved this spot. Wind chimes hung from a low branch, crafted from tarnished spoons and forks that caught the fading sunlight. As the breeze picked up, the chimes began to sing. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the gentle melody wash over her. Something about the sound unlocked a memory, her mother humming the same tune while brushing Sarah's hair, the scent of fresh bread still clinging to her clothes. "I remember this," she whispered to no one. The loneliness that had been her constant companion seemed to shift slightly, making room for something else, connection. Here under this tree with these sounds, she wasn't completely alone. The wind carried echoes of better days. Sarah sat with her back against the rough bark, listening until twilight faded to darkness. The melodies, haunting yet familiar, became a secret comfort. She began humming along, matching the chime song note for note. Emily would understand this feeling, Sarah thought, but her friend had been kept away by watchful parents who feared Margaret's influence. Michael Davis was confined to bed rest according to town gossip, his health deteriorating even as his determination seemed to grow. As night fell completely, Sarah reluctantly headed back toward the house, the sound of the chimes following her like a protective spell. For the first time in months, she felt something like peace, a small warmth kindling inside her chest that even Margaret couldn't extinguish. The bakery was hers by right. The chimes were her mother's voice. These truths, however small, were weapons against the darkness. Thomas Thompson had always been a man of quiet habits, but his recent fixation with Michael Davis had transformed him into something of a local detective. The historian spent countless hours in the dusty records office, poring over yellowed documents and faded photographs that chronicled Willow Creek's past. "There's something not right about the Johnson estate transfer," he muttered to himself, connecting threads that had remained separate for years. His fingers traced the lineage of property ownership, stopping at the suspicious gap that appeared shortly after Sarah's mother passed away. The rightful heir had seemingly vanished from all legal documents, replaced by Margaret's name in suspiciously neat handwriting. Thomas made careful notes, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he worked. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture: a child deliberately erased from her own inheritance, a fortune diverted, and a history rewritten by careful manipulation. Meanwhile, Willow Creek buzzed with preparation for the annual Maypole dance. Colorful ribbons adorned the town square as children practiced their steps under the watchful eyes of proud parents. Sarah Johnson stood at the periphery, her small frame almost invisible among the excited crowd. Margaret had permitted her attendance only after Mrs. Brown had insisted it would look suspicious if Sarah were absent. The celebration began with traditional music, the townsfolk gathering in concentric circles around the decorated pole. When the official ceremonies concluded, local children were invited to share songs or poems. Sarah remained silent, watching others step forward confidently. As the afternoon waned and the event began to disperse, Sarah found herself near the makeshift stage. Almost without thinking, she began to sing softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her when nightmares came. Her voice, though quiet, carried a pure, haunting quality that made several elderly residents turn their heads. Mrs. Peterson, the oldest woman in town, froze mid-conversation. "That melody," she whispered, her wrinkled hand clutching at her chest. "I haven't heard it since I was a girl." Mr. Jenkins, the retired postmaster, nodded slowly. "That's the Johnson family lullaby. My grandmother used to sing it. Said it belonged to one of the founding families." Eyes turned toward Sarah, seeing her truly for the first time. The girl's voice continued, unaware of the stir she was creating, the notes floating like memories awakened from long slumber. "Who is this child, really?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret, noticing the gathering attention, quickly moved to collect Sarah, but not before Thomas Thompson had witnessed the entire scene, another piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place. Michael Davis sat in his study, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the final documents establishing the Sarah Johnson Scholarship Fund. Though his doctor had warned him to rest, this couldn't wait. His cough had worsened over the past weeks, and the medication barely took the edge off his pain. When Sarah arrived after school, her eyes widened at the sight of the official papers. Michael smiled weakly, gesturing for her to sit beside him. "I wanted to ensure your education would never be compromised," he explained, his voice softer than usual. "No matter what happens with the estate, this fund is yours alone. Your future is brighter than you know." Sarah ran her fingers over the embossed letterhead, unable to speak. No one had ever invested in her future before. The millionaire's kindness filled her with hope, yet seeing his pallor and labored breathing made her heart ache. She knew, without being told, that his time was growing short. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the document to her chest. On her way home, Sarah took a detour past the bakery. The smell of fresh bread reminded her of happier times, before Margaret had entered their lives. To her surprise, Edith Brown was locking up early, her usual meticulous routine abandoned. "Sarah," the baker's wife called out, her voice uncharacteristically urgent, I need to speak with you. They walked to the small park behind Main Street, where Edith nervously twisted her apron between her fingers. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. I've been a coward, Mrs. Brown finally said, her eyes fixed on the ground. There's something you should know about the night your father disappeared. Sarah held her breath as Edith revealed what she had witnessed years ago. Margaret hurriedly burning documents in the backyard fire pit, the flames illuminating her determined face. It was late, and I was delivering a special order to your neighbor, she explained. I saw her through the fence, feeding papers into the fire. When your father left the next day, I suspected those documents were important. Why didn't you say anything? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Edith's shoulders slumped with the weight of her confession. I was afraid. Margaret had already spread rumors that nearly ruined my business once, but I can't stay silent anymore, not after seeing what she's done to you. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. What documents had been so important that Margaret needed to destroy them? The revelation connected to the mysteries in her mother's journal, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. We need to tell Michael, Sarah said, determination replacing her shock. Before it's too late. The soft crackling of the fireplace cast dancing shadows across Sarah Johnson's face as she and Emily Smith huddled together on the worn rug. Between them lay her mother's journal, its pages yellowed with age and secrets. Outside, winter had settled over Willow Creek, but inside, a different kind of chill ran through Sarah as her small finger traced her mother's elegant handwriting. Look at this entry, Emily whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Your mother mentions a will hidden where only the melody can find it. The spirited girl leaned closer, her loyalty unwavering despite her parents' warnings to stay away from the Johnson household. Sarah nodded, her creative mind racing. The piano! It must be in the old piano at the estate. She turned another page carefully, as if handling a precious artifact. She writes about trusting only one person with the truth, someone with a golden watch. Michael Davis, Emily breathed. The pocket watch he gave you. Each journal entry they deciphered was another thread in a tapestry of betrayal. Sarah's mother had suspected someone close was after the family fortune. The entries grew more frantic toward the end, with warnings and coded messages about protecting her daughter's inheritance. Your real last name isn't even Johnson, Emily pointed out, indicating a passage where Sarah's mother had written her daughter's full birth name. Margaret changed it after your mother died. Sarah felt something hardening inside her, not hatred, but resolve. The hungry little girl who once pressed her face against the bakery window was finding her voice, her truth, her power. Across town, Margaret's carefully constructed social world was beginning to unravel. At the monthly ladies' auxiliary meeting, conversation stopped abruptly when she entered the room. Mrs. Fairchild, once her closest ally, made a flimsy excuse to avoid sitting beside her. I heard Michael Davis has been asking questions at the county records office, whispered Mrs. Henderson to another woman, just loudly enough for Margaret to overhear. The stepmother maintained her composure, her cunning mind already plotting countermoves. But doubt had been planted in the community's collective consciousness. People remembered how quickly she'd taken control after Sarah's mother died, how the child had changed from cheerful to withdrawn overnight. Even Pastor Williams, who had always deferred to Margaret's generous church donations, watched her with new eyes during Sunday service. The facade of respectability that had protected her was developing hairline fractures. That evening, as Sarah carefully returned the journal to its hiding place, she heard Margaret's footsteps approaching her attic room. She quickly slipped the precious book beneath her mattress, her heart pounding. The time for confrontation was coming, and for the first time, Sarah felt ready. Mr. Thompson burst through the church doors, his weathered hands clutching yellowed papers that trembled with the weight of their revelation. The local historian had spent weeks combing through dusty archives, and what he discovered left him breathless. I found it, he announced to Sarah Johnson and Emily Smith, who had been waiting anxiously on the worn wooden pew. "The church marriage records and your birth certificate. Margaret deliberately altered your surname after your mother passed. You were never meant to be Sarah Johnson. You're Sarah Bennett, sole heir to the Bennett estate." The girls exchanged glances, Emily squeezing her friend's hand as Sarah absorbed the enormity of this truth. The documents laid bare Margaret's calculated deception, a legal sleight of hand that had diverted Sarah's inheritance into her stepmother's control. "She changed everything about me," Sarah whispered, tracing her finger over her true name. "Not just my life, but my identity." The evidence was irrefutable. Margaret had systematically erased Sarah's rightful claim, manipulating records while the town grieved her mother's passing. But confronting her stepmother with this knowledge meant risking the fragile security Sarah had managed to build. Margaret still controlled everything: their home, Sarah's daily life, and the powerful social connections that had kept the town silent for years. "What will you do?" Emily asked, her loyalty unwavering despite her parents' continued objections to their friendship. Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Mrs. Brown. Michael Davis had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Sarah raced through Willow Creek's quiet streets, past the bakery where she'd once pressed her hungry face against the glass, toward the small cottage where Michael had taken residence. Her heart pounded with each step, fear and determination propelling her forward. The philanthropist lay pale against white sheets, his breathing labored. When he saw Sarah enter, a smile transformed his face. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I did," Sarah replied, fighting back tears. With trembling fingers, Michael reached for the pocket watch that never left his side. The gold gleamed in the afternoon light as he pressed it into her palm. "This was your father's," he revealed. "Your mother gave it to me for safekeeping until you were ready." The watch felt warm and impossibly heavy in Sarah's small hand. "Remember who you are," Michael whispered, his voice growing fainter. "Sarah Bennett, your mother's daughter, the rightful heir, brave enough to face the truth." Sarah closed her fingers around the timepiece, feeling its steady tick against her skin, like a heartbeat, like courage, like hope finally taking tangible form. The morning of the town hall meeting dawned with an unusual stillness over Willow Creek. The historic building, normally quiet on weekdays, buzzed with anticipation as residents filed in, their whispers creating a symphony of speculation. Sarah Johnson stood at the back, her small hands clutching her mother's journal, each page a fragment of the truth she was about to share. Emily Smith squeezed her friend's arm. "You can do this," she whispered, her loyalty unwavering despite her parents' disapproval. As the meeting commenced, Sarah made her way to the front, each step feeling both impossible and inevitable. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her worn shoes. For years, these same townspeople had averted their eyes when Margaret dragged her through the streets. Today, they couldn't look away. "I've been silent for too long," Sarah began, her voice initially trembling but finding strength with each word. The crowd leaned forward collectively, straining to hear the child they had overlooked for years. Margaret Johnson burst through the side door, her face contorted with rage. "This is preposterous. She's just a confused child with an overactive imagination." Her voice, once commanding enough to silence rooms, now sounded shrill against the walls of the town hall. "Let her speak," came a voice from the crowd. It was Edith Brown, the baker's wife, standing tall despite her husband's nervous tugging at her sleeve. Sarah unfolded a document Michael Davis had helped her recover before his condition worsened. "This is my birth certificate," she explained. "My real name is Sarah Elizabeth Thornwood. The estate on the hill belonged to my mother and legally to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Thornwood name carried weight in Willow Creek, a family that had founded the town generations ago. "She's lying," Margaret shouted, lunging forward. but two men gently blocked her path. Sarah continued, her words painting the picture of a childhood stolen, of documents burned, of a name changed to erase an inheritance. She spoke not with hatred, but with a clarity that made denial impossible. "I don't want revenge," she said, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces. "I want the truth to be known." Mr. Thompson, the local historian, stood up with county records in hand, confirming everything Sarah had said. One by one, townspeople rose, sharing small observations, moments when something had seemed wrong, but they'd remained silent. Margaret's carefully constructed facade crumbled as Sarah's voice, clear and unwavering, filled the room with truths too long buried. In that moment, the girl with the saddest eyes became the strongest presence in Willow Creek, and even the most skeptical neighbors felt something shift in their hearts. The town hall erupted into chaos as Margaret Johnson's carefully constructed facade crumbled before everyone's eyes. The legal documents Michael Davis had discovered lay spread across the table, irrefutable evidence of her deception. Sarah Johnson stood at the center of it all, her small frame somehow commanding the room's attention. "You altered my name," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You hid my mother's will and took everything that was meant for me." Margaret's face contorted with rage and desperation. "You ungrateful child! I gave you a roof, clothes, and education." "But never love," Sarah interrupted. "Never the truth." The townsfolk murmured, their collective shock palpable. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, county records in hand. The documents show Margaret changed Sarah's surname immediately after her mother's death, effectively cutting her off from her inheritance. Emily Smith pushed through the crowd to stand beside her friend, grabbing Sarah's hand and squeezing it tightly. "Tell them everything," she whispered. Edith Brown rose from her seat, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I saw her burning papers the night Sarah's father disappeared," the baker's wife confessed. "I've carried that secret for years, God forgive me." Margaret lunged toward Mrs. Brown. "You have no proof. This is slander." But the dam had broken. One by one, neighbors stepped forward with their own testimonies. The strange circumstances of Sarah's mother's death, Margaret's sudden wealth, the girl who was never allowed to speak at community gatherings. Sarah felt a strange power surge through her. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, her stepmother exposed, humiliated, punished. The fantasy had sustained her through countless hungry nights. Yet now, facing Margaret's unraveling, Sarah felt an unexpected emotion stirring within her. "What do you want from me?" Margaret finally asked, her voice barely audible. The room fell silent. Everyone watched as Sarah considered the woman who had caused her so much pain. The pocket watch Michael had given her felt heavy in her pocket, a reminder of promises and second chances. "I want the truth," Sarah said simply, "not revenge." Emily squeezed her hand again, pride shining in her eyes. Mrs. Brown stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders. Around them, the villagers of Willow Creek looked at the girl with new eyes, not as the pitiful, hungry child at the bakery window, but as someone with extraordinary courage. In that moment, Sarah understood that true power wasn't in punishment, but in choosing a different path than the one Margaret had shown her. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she wouldn't walk it alone. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Johnson stood before the judge, her small frame somehow commanding the space. Margaret's crimes had been laid bare: the forged documents, the hidden inheritance, years of neglect and cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming, and the town of Willow Creek waited with bated breath for justice to be served. But when asked what punishment she thought fitting for her stepmother, Sarah surprised everyone. "I don't want her to go to prison," she said softly. "I want her to understand what she did wrong and help other children who are suffering." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Margaret looked up, confusion replacing the hardened mask she'd worn throughout the trial. The judge leaned forward, studying Sarah's face for any sign of coercion or fear. "Are you certain about this, young lady?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Hate only makes more hate. My mother taught me that before she died." Under the terms Sarah proposed, Margaret would confess publicly, return all stolen assets, and perform extensive community service at local children's homes. The stepmother, facing the alternative of years behind bars, accepted with trembling hands. "Your compassion is extraordinary," Michael's lawyer whispered to Sarah as they left the courthouse. He would have been proud. Emily Smith rushed to embrace her friend, tears streaming down her face. "You're the bravest person I know," she said, squeezing Sarah's hand. The following week, Sarah sat nervously in the small recruiting booth at Willow Creek's radio station. The red light blinked on, and she began telling her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Her voice, clear and unwavering, reached homes throughout the county. "What happened to me happens to many children," she explained. "But today, I'm asking you to help build something new." She outlined her vision for Hope House, a shelter where children could find safety, nourishment, and understanding. By afternoon, the station's phone lines were jammed with callers pledging support. Mrs. Brown arrived with fresh bread and tears in her eyes, promising the bakery would provide daily meals for the shelter. "Your mother would be so proud," Edith whispered, embracing Sarah. Even some of Margaret's former social circle stepped forward, perhaps seeking redemption for their years of silent complicity. Within days, donations had surpassed all expectations, enough to purchase the abandoned schoolhouse on Maple Street and begin renovations. Sarah stood on the steps of her future shelter, watching volunteers paint walls and build furniture. The girl who once pressed her hungry face against a bakery window now held the keys to a place where no child would ever be turned away from a meal again. Willow Creek transformed with the passing seasons. The town that once held its breath under Margaret Johnson's influence now exhaled freely, its very air seeming lighter. Autumn painted the landscape in warm hues, and for the first time in years, Sarah Johnson watched the changing colors with genuine joy, rather than quiet desperation. The estate gates that had stood rusted and forbidding for so long creaked open one crisp afternoon, not by force or key, but by something more powerful: music. Sarah sat at her mother's restored piano, fingers dancing across ivory keys, playing the lullaby that had haunted her dreams. The melody, carried on the breeze, seemed to whisper to the ancient lock mechanisms, and before the gathered townspeople's astonished eyes, the gates swung open as if welcoming them home. "It's like magic," Emily Smith whispered, squeezing her friend's hand. The loyal girl had never wavered in her support, even when her parents had forbidden their friendship. "Not magic," Sarah replied softly. "Just truth finding its way." Edith Brown wiped tears from her eyes as she watched. The baker's wife had found redemption in her eventual courage and now supplied the estate with fresh pastries for community gatherings. Her husband's recipes, combined with those Sarah had discovered in her mother's old cookbooks, brought the bakery back to its former glory. Children now gathered regularly in the estate gardens, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence that had once enveloped the property. Where Margaret had built walls, Sarah created bridges. The young girl distributed warm bread with her own hands, remembering all too well the gnawing pain of hunger and the cold glass of the bakery window that had once separated her from nourishment. "There's always enough for everyone," she would say, her voice gentle but firm. The townsfolk who had once averted their eyes now met her gaze with respect. Mr. Thompson, the local historian who had helped uncover the truth, often brought students to learn about resilience and community responsibility. Even those who had been complicit in their silence found ways to make amends. Michael Davis's legacy lived on through the scholarship foundation bearing his name. Though he hadn't survived to see Sarah fully restored to her rightful place, his pocket watch remained close to her heart, a reminder of promises kept. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, Willow Creek continued its healing. Sarah was no longer defined by her suffering. She was the heart of a community reborn, the keeper of stories, and the girl who transformed hunger into abundance. Sarah Johnson stood at the wrought iron gates of the estate, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns that had once seemed so forbidding. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh possibilities as she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. The property, her rightful inheritance, stretched before her, no longer a symbol of loss, but of reclamation. "It still feels like a dream sometimes," she whispered, watching children play tag across the sprawling lawn that had once been empty and neglected. Emily Smith nudged her playfully. "Not a dream. You earned this." Her friend had remained steadfast through it all, defying her parents and the town's whispers to stand by Sarah's side. Nearby, Edith Brown arranged freshly baked loaves on a table beneath the oak trees. The baker's wife caught Sarah's eye and smiled warmly. The guilt that had once shadowed her face now replaced with quiet determination. She had become like family in the months since Margaret's exposure, teaching Sarah her grandmother's recipes and sharing stories of her mother's childhood visits to the bakery. "The children are asking for your story again," Edith called. Sarah laughed. "Which part? The hungry girl or the happy ending?" "Both," Emily answered. "They need to know that both can be true." The estate had transformed under Sarah's care. Where once silence had reigned, now laughter echoed through corridors. The gardens bloomed with wildflowers, and the community center she had established in the East Wing welcomed townsfolk who had once averted their eyes from her suffering. Sarah carried Michael's pocket watch everywhere, a tangible reminder of his belief in her. Though he hadn't lived to see her triumph, his presence remained in the scholarship fund bearing his name, and in the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. Margaret was gone now, not imprisoned as many had demanded, but living under supervision in a neighboring county, required to perform community service and undergo counseling. Sarah's choice of mercy over vengeance had startled Willow Creek, but it had also begun a deeper healing. "Ready?" Emily asked as children gathered around the picnic tables. Sarah nodded, picking up a basket of warm bread. She moved among them, offering nourishment freely, remembering the girl who had once pressed her face against the bakery window, desperate for a single crumb. "I am not what happened to me," she thought, watching the sun set over Willow Creek. "I am what I choose to become." And as twilight descended, Sarah Johnson, once the hungry child with sad eyes, now the heart of a community reborn, broke bread with friends who had become family, her story still unfolding, her heart finally completely full.